Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Today I'm going to present to you some of the evidence regarding a potential connection between gluten and multiple sclerosis. Yes, here it comes. I assume we do not have too much experience with multiple sclerosis, so I'll just start by introducing you to the disease, and there I'll head on to the main part of my talk, being our systematic review that has recently been published in multiple sclerosis and related disorders. I'll start by explaining to you why we thought a review like this is important, how and what we did, what we found, and what we believe are the next steps from now on. If we have time, I will shortly introduce you to our clinical trial with gluten-free dieting in multiple sclerosis, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions in the end. So what is multiple sclerosis? MS, just like celiac disease, another chronic autoimmune disease, but this time it's not the gut that is the primary target, but our central nervous system consisting of the brain and the spinal cord. To be more specific, in MS we have loss of tolerance towards myelin antigens, and myelin is the fatty sheet that insulates the axons of our neurons, ensuring that electrical signals can be transported quickly and effectively between different parts of our nervous system. So in MS, we have inflammation in the nervous system that is actually centered around what we call lesions or plaques. Neurological symptoms do occur due to demyelination, and these are actually, at least in the beginning, are reversible, as remyelination can occur. However, if the axon of the neuron itself also get damaged, then the symptoms will be irreversible. So just some quick facts about multiple sclerosis. Most patients, at least in the beginning of the disease, do experience periods of symptom exacerbation, also called attacks, and those periods are then followed by more stable periods where there is no evidence of disease activity, and we have partial and even full resolution of symptoms. MS patients can experience a broad variety of symptoms, and this depends on which part of the central nervous system is affected at each time. It has been estimated that approximately 2.5 million people live with multiple sclerosis today, and there's a clear female predominance. The mean age of diagnosis is 30 years of age, so we're talking about young adults. Getting a diagnosis of MS is quite devastating. The disease is not curable, but we do have some good treatments, and the life expectancy is actually as long as for that of the general population. Of course, I'm not going to go into detail with the pathogenesis. This is just to show you it's highly complex, and just to make it even more complicated, in MS we have two different compartments. So autoimmune lymphocytes do have to breach the blood-brain barrier before they're able to cause any damage to myelin. And the areas where lymphocytes have managed to breach the barrier, they can be visualized using MRI, so we can see it as the white dots, lesions or plaques that here are seen around the ventricles. So my last slide about multiple sclerosis, I want you to know that there are different forms of multiple sclerosis. Most patients are diagnosed with what's called relapsing remitting MS. So we have those periods with symptom exacerbation followed by more stable periods where actually the patient can have a normal, or at least completely normal, almost normal life. The majority of the patients, however, later on do develop what's called secondary progressive MS, where we have fewer and fewer attacks and the progression of the disability is more progressive. And then 10 to 15% of patients are diagnosed with primary progressive MS, so experiencing no attack, but just progressive increase in disability slowly from the beginning. The last thing I want you to remember, and that's because it's used in some of the studies that I'm going to present, is the Expanded Disability Status Scale, also called just EDSS. It's a scale that is used to quantify disability. It ranges from 0 to 10, 0, no symptoms at all, 10 deaths from MS, everything above 5, inability to walk without aids, and scoring is based on neurological examination. So I will here start telling you a bit more about the evidence. If we just do a quick search on the internet for MS diets, we will come up with a lot of different dietary regimens that are proposed, and a lot of them also suggest abstaining from gluten. However, today we do not have any dietary guidelines specific for multiple sclerosis, and that's why it's very important for clinical practitioners being in contact with MS patients to be well informed about the current level of evidence on the different dietary related topics. So we wanted to provide answers to what we thought was 3 important questions. First one, can patients with multiple sclerosis benefit from a gluten-free diet? Question number 1, number 2, is there an increased prevalence of markers of gluten reactivity in patients with MS compared to the healthy populations? And question number 3, which I believe is also the most important question for celiac disease patients, is there an increased risk of developing MS if you have celiac disease or the other way around? So we conducted our systematic review in accordance to the PRISMA statement, being a form of good clinical practice for systematic reviews. If you're more interested in the methodology, you can find our protocol registered in Prospero, and this is an international database of systematic reviews in a similar way to clinicaltrials.org. So we had to find a way to identify relevant publications. So we we find a search strategy, use 6 of the most common databases and a predefined set of keywords. And we found 884 hits, and this is from the search in all 6 databases. And after screening, we identified 49 publications that would actually meet our inclusion criteria. So if we start with the first question, if gluten-free diet can be beneficial for MS patients, we have here 4 publications investigating effects of gluten-containing diets on MS-related endpoints. And the studies by Bisht et al. And Iris et al. Actually being the same research group, just with 2 different first authors. They investigated whether the first one, Bisht et al., a multimodal intervention that also included a gluten-free diet. So gluten-free diet, but also abstaining from dairy, ensuring to eat a wide variety of vegetables, and receiving massage and meditating, if that could have an effect on perceived fatigue and health-related quality of life. And it did, and so did the study by Iris et al., where this time the intervention was only dietary, but again, not just gluten, also eliminating dairy and other things. So the main issue with using studies like that here is that we cannot say how much of the effect is due to eliminating gluten and how much is from the other factors. Then we have an old survey from 1998 here, actually being a case control study with 197 MS patients and 202 healthy controls. And they wanted to identify potential dietary-related health risk factors for the development of multiple sclerosis. So they used a validated 164-item food frequency questionnaire, and what they found was that eating cereals and breads was actually protective against multiple sclerosis in all subjects and males, but this was not statistically significant for females. And I actually do not believe that this is related to gluten here, and this is especially because there is an inconsistency between gluten-containing items. So pizza and pasta, not significant at all. Cakes, not either. So maybe it's just the whole grain or the fibers, or just something completely different that's in cereals and breads. Now, moving on, this is what I believe is the strongest evidence that we have right now. A clinical trial comparing a gluten-free diet to a regular diet in a series of relapsing remitting MS patients. That's exactly what we need. So 72 patients agreed to participate in the study, and they were all offered to go on a gluten-free diet. After 6 months, and then do a follow-up. And the patients who had left the diet or committed frequent irregularities, they were then put on the control group and had to follow a regular diet. Whereas the people who did stick to the gluten-free diet, they will put in the intervention continuing on the gluten-free diet. And this is what they call a randomization. And I would have to disagree here, because I do not believe it's random who ends up being in the intervention group and who ends up being in the control group here. But let's look at some of the endpoints. The study had a median a period of 4.5 years, and they actually have some really good MS-related endpoints, annual relapse rate. So on average, how many relapses did each patient have per year, the EDSS score, and MRI activity. So we can see that in the gluten-free diet, there was a lower, but not significantly lower, annual relapse rate, but there were significant differences in EDSS score and MRI activity. So this points in the direction that a gluten-free diet actually can help patients with multiple sclerosis. However, they also noticed that there were 8 patients who were identified as celiac disease patients, and all those 8 actually ended up being in the gluten-free diet. Guess why? So this is actually a really big limitation with the study. Okay, I think I'll move on now. And this, I believe, the interesting question for celiac disease patients. And here we actually have some pretty good agreement among studies. No increased comorbidity between multiple sclerosis and celiac disease. Yes. So we're safe. And I'll just show you, this is the results from the first study here by Eton. It's a national study from Denmark with the entire population of Denmark, so almost 5.5 million people. And we can see the results here. So the numbers above the diagonal here are the number of comorbidity cases. So we had 6 people in the entire population of Denmark that had both celiac disease and multiple sclerosis. And the odds ratio between the two diseases is actually 1.0. So no increased risk. And if we look down the column 5 here, we can actually see that celiac disease patients do have increased risk for a lot of other autoimmune diseases here. But it seems that there's nothing for multiple sclerosis here. However, if we look at this study, and it's the same research group that did the clinical trial with the gluten-free dieting, and I would believe the same 72 MS patients here. They found no difference in HLA-DQ2 markers between those MS patients and 123 healthy controls, but they did find the 8 celiac disease patients, and we have 8 patients with both diseases among 72 MS patients, where how many did we have here? 6 among the entire population of Denmark. And I can tell you that the prevalence of MS in Denmark is around 15,000 to 16,000 MS patients. So there's something not completely right here. If we look in their methodology and their discussion, they say that they have used a corrected threshold for positivity for their IgA TG antibodies. And I'm, of course, not the expert in diagnosing celiac disease. They did find MARS 3 classifications, but we also heard that there are some issues with biopsies. My point here is that when we do not have a standardized way of diagnosing celiac disease and maybe also multiple sclerosis, this can lead to inconsistency among our prevalence studies. These two studies now, they looked at positivity, the prevalence for DQ2 and DQ8, finding no difference between MS patients and healthy controls. However, if we look at the graphs here, this study did find that patients with MS had higher mean values of antibodies against tissue transglutaminase, both IgA and IgG. However, 5 different studies here, again looking at the same endpoint, but this time comparing number of seropositive patients. Here we do not find anything. Now another study, this time again like the first one, comparing mean values. They don't find anything in tissue transglutaminase, but they find significant difference between the mean values of anti-gliadin antigens, IgA. However, if we look at the graph, it means that this one is different from this one. And it might be different, but I can see the difference is not huge. So there might be something, but it's small effect if there is anything. And it might be so small that here again they do not find any difference among 161 MS patients and 166 healthy controls, both comparing number of seropositive patients and mean, and also looking at 95% confidence intervals. However, here they actually also compared the different courses of MS, so patients with relapsing remitting and primary progressive, again not finding any differences. This study, so now you can see the results are getting a bit inconsistent. This study does find differences, and this is both IgA here over and IgG against gliadin and gluten. So patients with MS significantly higher mean values compared to controls. And actually we can see that they also have significantly higher IgA antibodies against casein. So now I start thinking, okay, I'm not sure if there is anything about this, but if there is anything, what would it mean if MS patient had a bit higher antibody levels? And the authors of the article here, they conclude or suggest there could be a possible moderately increased intake of some specific food proteins from the gut of MS compared to healthy controls. And this is probable. There has also been a pilot study showing that MS patients actually do have increased intestinal permeability when doing dual sugar absorption tests. But yeah, again, another study just like the other one here, we found there's a significant difference only in IgG, not in IgA, and they actually say that their findings supports the association between antibodies against gliadin and tissue transglutaminase to multiple sclerosis. The specific role of these antibodies in the pathogenesis of MS remains uncertain and requires additional research. A gluten-free diet should be considered in specific cases of patients who present with gluten antibodies. So that's what they write in the text. Now, actually, one of the last studies that I'm going to show to you, they measured levels of gut-related antibodies in patients with autoimmune diseases, including multiple sclerosis. Now I'll only show you the results from MS because that's what we focus on. So they found that in MS patients, there was a significantly higher number of individuals that were positive for at least one of those antibodies. But we can also see that people with NMO spectrum, anti-incorporate NMO is neuromyelitis optica. So it's a disorder where we know that in general there is an increased antibodies. So MS patients may in general have more antibodies, but we can see here it's not only anti-gluten antibodies, they also have antibodies against parietal cells. And in one of the previous studies, we also saw antibodies against casein. So the question is this even specific to gluten? And the other question, is this even specific to multiple sclerosis? Or is it just something about autoimmune disorders? I mean, we have inflammation, so it would make sense that you would have a bit higher levels of antibodies. This is actually the last study that I'm going to present to you. So if we look at the 3 questions again, so what can we say about it now? Can patients with MS benefit from a gluten-free diet? We only had one relatively good study studying isolated effects of gluten-free dieting. Positive results, but I would say some important limitations. And then, is there an increased prevalence of markers of gluten reactivity? Regarding positivity for HLA, DQ2, DQ8, none of the studies found anything. High inconsistency between the serology studies. And the last question, most studies would say that there is no increased risk of comorbidity between the 2 diseases. So what do we believe are the next steps? We definitely do believe that we need more clinical intervention trials, and we need them to study isolated effects of gluten-free diets, so not gluten-free plus plus plus. And we need to look at endpoints that are specific for multiple sclerosis, so just not just quality of life or so it has to be specific to multiple sclerosis. We would like to be able to compare results between the studies a bit better, and improved reporting could actually help in that. I think we need some new markers to study how people react to gluten. I think we need to move on from serology. And of course, people who are in contact with patients with MS need to be informed about the latest research, because it's a very debated topic and there's a lot of interest from the public. So we always need to stay critical on the research that comes and inform our patients. So a little bit about what we do. We actually are running a clinical trial right now. It's in Copenhagen. It's the University Hospital, Rigshospitalet. Those are 2 different departments of the hospital, the MS clinic and the MRI clinic. Then Bartholin Institute they have been working with gluten for many years, primarily focusing on type 1 diabetes, but now also working with multiple sclerosis, and then 2 different departments of the University of Copenhagen. So we are trying to see, can a gluten-free diet have an effect on what we think are some good biomarkers for multiple sclerosis, but we're also very interested in what's happening in the gut of multiple sclerosis. So do patients have increased intestinal permeability or reduced absorptive capacity? Is there any signs of inflammation within the gut? Are there any alterations in their fecal microbiome, their virome? But those results are still awaiting. We still have some time left. And that's what I have for you. Any questions are very welcome.